Welcome to session 12. Tonight we have the special privilege of looking at Moses as political leader. This book by Aaron Wildavsky is an exciting book because it examines in depth the case study of one of the key leaders in the Word of God. I'm excited about our discussion. I'm excited about the kinds of things that I have learned in reading this book, and I hope that you are as well. Tonight I'd like to reflect in our opening session on the idea of Moses' temptation and how that may affect us in terms of our leadership as well. Moses and I have a lot in common. I remember when I was asked to take this job as academic vice president of Biola that I really wasn't interested in it. Like Moses, I had another agenda. I had things that I wanted to do. And like Moses, I tended to be a passive leader coming into this situation. If we look in Exodus chapter 3, we see the evidence of Moses' passivity in verse 11. It says, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" I remember asking that same question myself. Who am I? Why should I do this? You know, I wasn't called to do this. Lord, I'm prepared for something else. And perhaps that's the way you are, and perhaps that's the way some others that you know in terms of Christian leadership are. They think, why should I be involved in that particular work? God confronts Moses on this and says, I'll be with you and I'll lead you, and Moses argues with him about this. Chapter 4, verse 1, he says, what if they don't believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? Again, the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. So Moses threw it on the ground, it became a snake. God wanted to demonstrate to Moses that in spite of the fact that he was nothing, that God was the power behind him. But Moses was still a reluctant leader. He didn't want to do the job. In chapter 4, verse 10, it tells us, Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. So in these three different situations, Moses complains and excuses himself from God's call and says, I'm not the person that you need. Find somebody else. I really can't do the job. Now, as I reflect on this, I remember going through exactly that process. 3 times I was asked to take this job, and 3 times I said no. I really didn't think that I wanted to do it. And the reason for that was that I was like Moses. I was resistant. I was a passive leader. I didn't want to take the situation or take the responsibilities that God was calling me to. It's interesting that God dealt with Moses in each of these situations and showed him very clearly that this is what he wanted him to do. Well, how about you? I certainly was convinced by God's leading in my life that he wanted me to follow him. He wanted me to take the work that I have. And I expect that that's probably what will happen to you as well. In leadership, there is this temptation to be passive, to stay back, as Moses did, to not commit yourself to the call that God has for you. To do that is to test God. And I would encourage you and challenge you as you reflect on Moses and on your own life to be willing to follow God and not provide the natural excuses. Well, welcome to our 12th and final session of the course on leadership. Our class tonight is on the syllabus on page 59, the discussion number 23, Moses as political leader. Our focus of our class tonight is discussion of this book by Aaron Wildavsky, the nursing father. And before we do that, I thought I'd just take a minute and reflect a little bit on Wildavsky and his background. As you read this and looked at this man as a person, what kind of things struck you, perhaps, as you looked at it?
I find it intriguing to read, we don't read too often in a Christian school environment, a book written from a Jewish context and looking at scriptures from a Jewish mind, and looking at Moses as a Jewish leader was really a significant transformation for me.
Okay. I found it the same. I really enjoyed discovering Wildavsky as a believing Jew, someone who, from the background that he described himself, his father having been an agnostic and a cultural Jew, but not really a believing Jew, and then him coming to this point. And I was intrigued with his reading of the King James Bible and taking that as the one that really communicated to him. It says something about his interest in literature, I suppose, and his literary desire. Any other observations on Wildavsky?
I thought it was interesting that he's from Berkeley. And is he still at Berkeley?
Yes, yes.
That's, I don't know, that just struck me as interesting that if a Jewish scholar were to come from Berkeley, he wouldn't be as orthodox as he is. Maybe he's not so orthodox, but...
Well, in fact, if you look at his stance about the student movements in the 60s and the Vietnam issue, he really comes from much more conservative orientation. I mean, he didn't go along with the crowd at that point. And I was thinking about his vote to the faculty, you know, his resolution to the faculty senate, in which he was in a great minority in that issue. There's another Jewish scholar at Berkeley by the name of Robert Alter, who has done some significant work on the Old Testament as literature. And he's actually going to be coming here to Biola in January for a special 3-day workshop, January 4th, 5th, and 6th. If any of you are here on campus during that time, there are going to be some public events that you would be welcome to attend. One of them will be a public lecture to Talbot and any other interested people. I think that's on Tuesday. And then another will be a public President's Luncheon on Wednesday. And if you can come, if you want to go, call my secretary and tell her you'd like to come to the luncheon, because we won't have enough faculty at that time. There's sure to be space. We have enough money. We can have you come to that luncheon. We'd be delighted to have you come and hear Alter and have an opportunity to interact, even ask questions and interact in the discussion period afterwards. So I mentioned that just for your interest, and perhaps you would have a chance to do that. Any other observations about the person, Wildavsky? As you read this, you come away with a sense of who he is and his thinking on these things. You may not know this, but Wildavsky is apparently quite well known as a political scientist. But he's also interested in anthropology, and he's worked with Mary Douglas on a number of different projects. Another book that they've done together is called Risk and Culture, and it's an assessment of the whole notion of what motivates people in terms of taking risks or not taking risks. What kind of cultural constraints play into their lives in terms of taking risk. And they use the same basic model that he uses in this book. And so it's something that if you're interested in that theory and would like to explore that further, I think Mary Douglas does more writing in that book, and therefore it's more obscure. Mary Douglas is not one of the most lucid, clear, easy to read authors that I've ever read. But the book is a provocative book, and there are some very good case studies in it. I think there are things that you might enjoy. Risk and Culture. This book is one that I just found this summer, and I really felt it was provocative and offered us a great deal of insight into the whole study of Moses as leader. So let's begin by taking a look at pages 21 to 23 in this book and exploring for a brief time the tables that you have here and comparing them to some of the things that I prepared in Transforming Culture. If you have there at your desk page 143 in Transforming Culture, I Xeroxed off the copy of table 7.1 there and have distributed it to you for your information. And what I'd like to do for the first part of our discussion tonight is to get you to think about the model and presentation that Wildavsky makes here and compare it to the analysis and the presentation that I did in Transforming Culture. You need to know that my work in Transforming Culture was done without any knowledge of what Wildavsky had done here. I found this book after I'd finished it. Now you could tell me that that was poor scholarship, Sherwood, because this was published quite a long time ago. Let's see, 1984. So I should have been able to read it before I wrote my book, but being negligent and not finding it until now, I didn't. In looking at it, Wildavsky's categories, slavery, anarchy, and equity and hierarchy, are categories that parallel the kinds of things that I have done in the chapter. So let's go back and I'll put my categories up here on the board for you, and then we'll add Wildavsky's. The first thing that I dealt with is the bureaucratic, and that's in the first box here. It's so large, so I'm going to right here next to it. The second one is corporate. And if we draw our little squares like this, then we can fill it in. The box down here is the individualist. And this one we call the collectivist. Okay, and looking at Wildavsky's categories, this one is obviously slavery. And this one is anarchy. This one is hierarchy. And this one is equity. Now, there are a number of words which writers on this whole subject have used to try to capture some of the essence of what happens in social life in these particular kinds of social environments. Wildavsky in this book has done it using these terms. In another book that I've read that Wildavsky is one of the authors in, there are three authors, Thompson, Ellis, and Wildavsky. They again use a different set of terms for these same basic social units. In that particular book, they talk about characteristics of worldview. And slavery is characterized by fatalism. Anarchy is characterized by individualism. And equity is characterized by egalitarianism. And the hierarchy is characterized by hierarchicalism. I don't need to write that in again because it's merely this expression of the same word. But each of these are trying to express something about the nature of how people look at the world. Now, I suppose if I were a slave existing in a bureaucratic social environment, I would rather have a fatalistic outlook on life. In other words, what can I do? What kind of power do I have? What kind of interaction can I do that is independent of those who are in power over me? And that's probably a pretty accurate assessment of the way that people would look at their lives. I think if we go back and look at Exodus, we'll see some of that. If you're in a situation of anarchy, obviously everybody does what's right in their own eyes. You have this individualism being pervasive. You have the whole notion that we can do what we want to do, that it's our way of doing it. As a person, I feel free to do what I'd like. Amy?
Like that, the second box represent judges.
Judges?
Yeah, and the first one represent, of course, Exodus. But
sure. Absolutely. You're right on target. You have the Exodus here and the judges being here. Once the Israelites get into the Promised Land, they revert to anarchy again.
Kingdom hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. So as you look at the development of Israel, you have the movement through these areas. Remember last week we talked about oscillation? Societies that kind of shift back and forth. Judges is actually an oscillation between these two. It's the notion that, hey, there's anarchy, every man does what's right in his own eyes, until we're victims of some outside force, like the Midianites who conquer us. And there we're threatened with slavery. And so to combat that, we unite around a leader like Moses, or a judge, and move to an equity position, and struggle then against the outside and fight against the outside and win. So Gideon and Deborah and some of those other key leaders that you have emerging in the book of Judges, they capitalize on this whole movement toward equity and following a particular leader in a group context and going off and fighting for their own defense. If you examine Judges pretty carefully, you'll find that there is a pretty strong emphasis on belonging in a group, on the clan, on the people of the clan, in terms of opposition with outsiders. And this notion of equity seems to pervade that. There's a great deal of rivalry that goes on in the book of Judges. And one group says to the other, what'd you go without us for? You should have consulted us. We're just as good as you are. You really should include us in this whole thing. So this notion of leaving us out as an insult to us is something that connotes this notion of equity. So at any rate, we have these categories that we're working with. Now, in looking at the discussion in Wildavsky's book, what I want you to do is to take a look at slavery, Model 1 on page 21, and compare that with the bureaucratic social environment that I discussed on page 143 in table 7.1. What do you see the complementary or possibly contradictory elements in those two comparisons? Sue?
Well, the power of the independent power, and then in his, he has scope of power unlimited, seem to be parallel. The idea that the CEO can make the decisions. And
okay, the notion of independent power then that I borrowed from Richard Adams is parallel to his notion of the despotic leader, you know, the one who has that kind of power over others. Okay, good. Anything else?
Clearly defined roles in both directions, as far as for people and for leaders,
okay,
which no one can move out of.
Okay. Clearly defined roles. No one can move out of them. In looking at the role definition, what do you see different in each one of those? What does my particular analysis focus on? What does Wildavsky's focus on?
Yours is more skill specialized.
Okay.
And his is more, this is basic slave labor.
Okay. Wildavsky really focuses on the extreme of this box. And I think that's important to understand. If you were to try to look at this whole area, remember that he talks about, in his introduction to this, he talks about the extremes. He says that what we're dealing with here are the extreme essences of each of these things. And that there are variations within a social environment. There are degrees to which this thing happens. So it's important to realize that what I have described for you here in talking about Christian college is not slavery, but it's a degree of bureaucratic social environment that has some of the components that are in slavery. In other words, that the extreme of that could become slavery. And so what you have in the book of Moses is this whole notion that there is this extreme possibility, and this could be a difficult situation for them. So, all right. Now, in looking at the in anarchy, for example, anarchy is also an extreme position. It's something that is, we wouldn't characterize our society as being anarchical, but it has the possibility of being that. It could move to that degree, but still individualism is a key component of many parts of our society. And so I think the notion of slavery and anarchy as he develops them are, as he says, extremes. And in talking about them as extremes, they represent the fullest implementation of that particular excess, if you will, in terms of social relationships. So what I'm really trying to define in this transforming culture is something that falls more to the middle of this category, or to, you know, as a component that's part of the analysis of society that don't fit into these extremes, but yet are more like the society that you know. At the same time, I hope you get from looking at these two some parallels. Take anarchy. If you compare anarchy and individualism in table 7.1, what do you see as similarities and differences there?
again, the power thing, that, you know, he points out that there's limited power. You know, the scope of power is very limited, and you talk about individuals grant power to one another. So a leader can't, you know, gather up all these individuals because we grant them individually to each other.
Good. So you've identified a key parallel there. In other words, we're talking about the same thing. Good. What does he add that I don't? What does he include in both of those categories that I don't have in there?
Religion.
Religion, exactly. He is dealing with the particular dimension of these social environments, if you will, that are the religious dimensions. Now, in another work that I'm working on, I have a couple of chapters that deal with religious issues. I didn't do that in Transforming Culture, but in my future work on it, I will. I was focusing only on community authority in that particular text. Wildavsky has a little bit of a bigger picture. He incorporates into this more than just the communal authority that's in focus. He brings it into the more broader cultural issue. And so I think that's important to note in terms of what he's doing. Religion is there. The notion of regime, which is kind of the rules of the game. He typifies the regime with a label. What do you think that I'm doing with regime? Well, I won't keep you guessing. Let me tell you. Okay.
We're not guessing.
I'm spelling it out in detail.
Yeah.
You see, what I've given you is really regime, but I haven't labeled it. I've really elaborated upon it. I've given you the structure of regime, how the rules of the game are set up, what are some of the key features of regime that are there. And so that stuff on community authority really goes into the nature of how authority would be structured with that particular kind of regime. So I point this out to you because it should help you as you look at the two works to begin to see the parallels between them, to see the kinds of things that Wildavsky does that are a little different, and what he does to add to what I have done, and perhaps what I've done that might add to what he's done in this framework. The other thing that he does that I don't do is he adds time and degree. Okay, what are time and degree?
The length of power.
Okay, the length of time in which power is in operation, or how it works through time would be more the dimension there. And I think that's an important issue in terms of the power relationships. And it's a good thing that always to consider in terms of what happens in dynamics of this type. What about the scope?
How much power, how influential,
Okay.
how extensive.
How extensive, the degree to which it's carried out. Again, this is an interesting question that he asks, and the nature of its definition is somewhat different from what I've done in that particular chapter. So there are some good things here that will really complement and expand the kind of thing that I've given to you. And if you look at equity and hierarchy, you see the same things are there, and they're elaborated further in terms of the kinds of questions that he's raised here. As you compare the religious things, what stands out as he looks at how the religious orientation changes between these four choices? What goes on there?
I'm not sure if this is answering the question, but I was just looking at the revelation, and the ones that we would say high grid, it's to the leaders, to the people.
Okay.
And then low grid, it's to the people. The revelation comes to the people, and then when we move over into the collectivists, then the leaders will communicate what the people have perceived, I guess.
Okay. The whole notion of revelation, to whom is the truth revealed, to whom is the religious truth revealed, how does that work? And the notion that it's different in each regime is an important notion. And it's one that really talks, this is the question of legitimacy now. Legitimate revelation. You see, that's really the key issue, because the notion of what is legitimate revelation varies as you go from one regime to another. The slavery one, only the rulers get revelation. And that's really the way it plays out in Exodus. Okay, it's an argument between Moses and Pharaoh as to who has the revelation. And Pharaoh says, you don't have it, I have it. Whereas in anarchy, everybody says, hey, I have just as much access to God as you do, right? And wasn't that some of what happened to Moses?
Miriam said, hey, what makes you ruler over us?
Okay, right. What makes you ruler over us? Who says that you're the only person that God can speak to? So we had that there. Okay, in the equity, what is the notion there?
It seems like, again, the people gathered around one leader. It's kind of like Amy was saying in Judges, that the people, it's a leader that brings people together in a collective. And he talks about the charismatic leader, Moses being, charismatic, and that's what brings people into a collective.
Okay. It's interesting, the story of all the Jewish elders going up on the mountain with Moses. And they go up there and purify themselves there to meet God. Those people down at the bottom of the mountain didn't go up. Some of them weren't allowed to go. But you have the notion of the collective elders going up and that God is going to appear to them. And that again communicates this whole idea of the groupness, the collective and the revelation to the group. Usually in equity regimes, it's the elders to whom the truth is revealed. That's often the way it works out. I remember, if you remember reading my Alcon stuff here and discussion of the Alcon in Transforming Culture, it was the elders who were the brokers for the ancestors. And if in the chapters that I've written but aren't included in Transforming Culture, having to do with ritual and having to do with worldview, the elders in the Alcon are ones through whom the ancestors reveal themselves by divining. They divine what the truth is, and they get it, and then they reveal that to the people. So there is that sense of the elders being the people through whom the truth is revealed, and that becomes then the truth for the group. Murray?
But didn't everybody experience the fire? Didn't everybody experience, you know, what happened in Egypt? Everybody saw the plagues. Everybody saw the Red Sea split. Everybody saw the pillar of fire. That's why, you know, when it was, the revelation was only to one, to Moses. You know, I see monotheism all the way through there, and a revelation to all men. And maybe I'm misunderstanding what he's saying here, but I didn't agree with that when I saw it.
Okay. What did you take exception to?
The idea that, for example, in the slavery, that a ruler is God, and his comparison to his whole thing about I am that I am, and as he talked about that, it became a Moses thing. Moses and God were arguing and brokering, and God was dealing with the entire nation at that point, wasn't he? It was a spiritual point, even for that. He was drawing them out it was a spiritual drawing out as much as a political drawing out, as I read Exodus.
Okay. Do any of you read that passage a little differently? Instead of my responding to Murray, do you see it the same way? Are you thinking the same thing in reflection on that?
Well, I think
Great.
that I don't see an intimacy, a relationship between the people of Israel and God at that time. There seems to be a distance, and that God is developing that through Moses, so that He's developing the relationship again. Well, you see that God says, "I have heard their cries," and now responding to them. But He's not responding directly with them. He's responding through Moses as the leader to get to them.
Now, why would you disagree with that, Murray?
Well, because at what point does God directly go? I mean, even when they're out in the wilderness, God only meets with Moses. It's still, Moses is more of a prophet there and a priest. He never does fully connect. I mean, the people never do come to the Lord the way we would come to Christ individually. And so, although Moses is still a priest and a prophet, you know, I don't see the relationship as that qualitatively different from Egypt. You know, God is always revealing Himself to individuals and to the nation, not just to Moses.
Okay, perhaps the problem is the notion of God's revelation. In looking at what Wildowski is talking about in terms of regime and religion. Let's separate the two for a minute. Let's just talk about religion for a moment. The religion of Egypt is one in which the Egyptians did believe that the Pharaoh was God. That was their whole notion, that he was deity, that he was part of a twin, that the supernatural part was the other side of it that people didn't see but was there, and so that you had this deity ruler that was there. Then the whole notion then of Pharaoh's interaction with the Israelites is one that I am God. So how is it that you can question me? How is it that you can say there is another God? Now, I think what Wildowski is saying is that the contest between Pharaoh and Moses is really one about who truly is God, and that Moses is not claiming to be God, whereas Pharaoh is, in fact. and that Moses is claiming that he has been sent by God, the I am. That the breakout of slavery is to convince the people that they should follow I am instead of following Pharaoh. And so that seems to be the contest that I hear him describing. Now, you're not hearing it the same way, I think.
Well, maybe I'm using his models trying to understand a culture the way your model is, these categories, the way your categories are. I see God revealing himself to a people, responding to their cries. You know, even in their unbelief, he's still responding to their cries, and you know, continually they cry out to God. They turn to the serpent in the wilderness.
Okay, so God is hearing their cries, and he is revealing himself, but he's doing it through Moses.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
And he continues to do that all the way.
Well,
until
not
they
quite.
reach the
He
border.
does, in fact, reveal himself to the whole people in Mount Sinai for a while. And then he backs out of that because he says, hey, they're not worthy. And Wildavsky discusses that at some length there. So we can get into that in a few minutes, and we can take a look at that maybe in the next session as we dig into some of the scriptures. The reason I want to follow up with this is because I think one of the things that you're doing with the model is one thing that I would like to try to correct for you at this point.
His model or your model?
Both.
Okay.
Okay. One thing you want to do is not think about the Jewish people as a culture as being A, B, C, or D. I present it that way somewhat in Transforming Culture, but that's really erroneous. What I would rather for you to think about is that as long as the Jewish people are in slavery in Egypt, they are part of a whole slave system. And while they are God's people, they have become conformed into that slave system, and they really are not able to respond to God apart from that prison of disobedience which they're in. They themselves become compliant within the slave relationship. And that's what I think Wildavsky describes as he begins to describe this dialogue. God's purpose is not only to hear their cries as slaves, but to help break them out of slavery, but they're unwilling to break out of it. Because they've become so accustomed to it, they've become so conformed to it, it's become part of their very nature of who they identify themselves as, that they can't conceptualize themselves as anything but slaves. Okay. At the same time, their cry to God is heard, and God then begins to respond to that. But God knows that to get them out of that, he has to break them out of the slavery, that they're not going to be willing to go out by themselves. And I think the whole notion then of God's working in Moses is for him to lead them. And that what he has to do is he has to not only convince Pharaoh, but also convince the Israelites it's good to go. And we've got some of that in the discussion a little bit later on the whole discussion of ambivalence. So maybe I can hold that off for a minute. But does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I see that.
Okay, now what I guess I would say is that they really don't become a people as far as Wildavsky is concerned until they get to here. And that's why he talks about the U-turn, Moses taking a U-turn. They're really not a people at all. They're in anarchy. Some of them want to go back to Egypt. Some of them want to go on. They're fighting with each other. They're fighting with Moses. They really don't comprise a culture, a comprehensive group. They're the extreme of individualism. They are out of slavery now, but they are utterly outraged in terms of, I mean, they're utterly out of control, I should say, not outraged. Utterly out of control in terms of what they should do. And so they begin to challenge Moses. They begin to challenge one another. We'll take a look at that in more detail. As they then begin to experience the trials and tribulations of the wilderness. And again, I think that's part of Wildavsky's argument, that they have to go through the wilderness to become a people. They couldn't become a people because they'd turn around and go back into slavery if they'd taken an easy route. And so God sent them on a rough route to make them into a people, because he knew if they went on an easy route, as soon as they hit the first difficulty, they'd run back into Egypt and be slaves again because they were so used to it. So here they were across the Red Sea. They couldn't go back because the sea was between them. And at that point, they hit the rough stuff, and they rebel against Moses, and you have all of this anarchy. Now, the process here is a group of people. They're not really a society yet. They have a heritage. They've got a language. They have been in this other place, but you can't really call this society. It's chaos. It's anarchy. And so the process, as Wildavsky is describing it, is then that the next step to try to make them a people, for God to bring them together, is to move into this phase that comes about through the crises that they're in. And then in this phase, there are problems that erupt here, which we'll discuss more next week. As they get into equity and move into hierarchy, what you get happening here is the people believing that somehow they can get communication from God as a group. And that's when the elders go up in the mountain and you have God appearing in the mountain. But they fall into sin. And the golden calf becomes a key component of that. They all together say, Aaron, make us a god. And Aaron becomes the compliant leader, and he says, okay, I'll do it. And so in equity, they sin. They sin in a gross and heinous way. And at that particular point, Moses then takes complete authority. I mean, he takes authority. I mean, he is the authority. He's the one that God works through. And you have then movement more into this direction for the final step. Now, that doesn't mean that that's where they stay, because what we notice is when they get into Canaan, they come back to anarchy again. That in the Judges, you've got anarchy, and then you've got some oscillation here. The whole dynamic of regime, however, does affect their religious life. And what I would say is that one of the lessons that I get out of this is not that this is how God works, but it's God working through our limitations as we move in each one of these social environments to help us to see Him and understand Him. And that I don't know that Wildavsky would exactly say it the way we would say it with our firm commitment in the Christian faith, but he seems to be saying that in his Jewish faith. In his Jewishness, he sees God as truly acting here. And as I read this book, I see a man who believes in God. I see a man who believes in God's revelation. He's not an atheist scholar who's coming to it. He really is a believing Jew. And so I sense that as I read. So we have that in common. And as we look at this, what I think we're seeing is, and this is why I appreciate the book, Wildavsky saying, as God tries to reveal Himself to these people, what does regime do to them in terms of keeping them from obeying, keeping them from following, and how does leadership respond to try to bring them, or fail to respond? And so the notion of what we can learn from this study is perhaps not necessarily through Wildavsky's eyes, but through our own, and through our study of the Scripture. What does the Scriptures teach us then about how Moses responded to slavery, how he helped people in that struggle, how he responded to anarchy, what he learned as a leader in that process, and so on. So here you have the same culture with all these social environments in time and space changing. What I wanted to do when I first started working with this is that I would make each one of these steps a major cultural change. What I see is a continuity of culture here, but social environment and regime changing as the dynamics of leadership change, with obviously some cultural consequences, in outcomes. And you could have, the Midianites are interacting here with them. You have Balaam over here, and the Barak, the kings of that area, interacting with them. And there's the dynamic of other cultures always around interacting with them, but that plays in a different way. Now, where are you in this?
I don't want to lead us down another rabbit trail here.
Okay, no, but I want to hear your question.
Well, what I'm seeing is then a regime that is more conducive to monotheism than other regimes. Hierarchy is the conducive regime to monotheism.
Okay.
And slavery is not conducive to monotheism. That's the thing that I'm wrestling with.
Okay. All right.
Now, am I reading that right? Is that what he's saying? I know
I'm
this
not
is
sure.
This is just a case study on Moses and on Israel. I can see it in that, but I'm trying to take it out of that context then and say, okay, let's look at regime in general.
I think one of the things that he would say is that that leading the people of Israel to a clear, unadulterated monotheism, they had to go through this process. Okay. But I don't think he would say that this is the only regime where you can have unadulterated monotheism. What he would say is that that was what the Israelites had to go through to get there.
And I understand that.
And
I guess I'm trying to take it that next step and say, what about the Dani Indians that you studied?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or what about,
could they understand monotheism without going through that?
A corporate structure, a corporate regime?
I think that the Dani have to understand something of the authority of God, and that's going to be a step away from individualism and anarchy. I think that's probably true, that they're going to have to go through this step. That doesn't mean that their society will have to be hierarchical in the end, because we have churches that represent all of these, okay, that embrace any one of these different regimes, if you will, in terms of playing out their Christian faith, living it out, working it out, leading it out in terms of the worlds in which they live. But these people, the Dani, are people that really don't have a notion of authority that they really are committed to. And so one of the things they've got to do is they've got to reach a point where they're willing to accept that. Now that may come through the teaching of the Scripture, it may come through the showing of the Jesus film, it may come through some significant transformation in their lives. I think that that's one of the reasons why these Indians are so resistant to the gospel. That you have, for example, one guy worked with a group of Indians called the Jamwanji who were 30 years there without ever responding to the gospel. And finally, in just a real breakthrough in the past year, another person came in, they showed the Jesus film, and they showed it several times because the people wanted to see it again. And suddenly things clicked. Things fell into place, and all the things they'd been hearing, they responded to. I don't know exactly what went on in their minds, but they began to see that, yes, there was a God who was authority, that there was His Son, Jesus Christ, and somehow they captured that message. Now, I don't think that they would, any more than the Israelites did, become a corporate hierarchy with all the attributes thereof. What happened to the Israelites is they ended back up down here, oscillating between these two, because the social changes were such and the leadership was such that the leadership couldn't sustain them there. And part of their movement back here was idolatry. If you remember that, that's exactly what happened. They began to worship any idol that they wanted. They made their own idols because that was a necessary part of somehow struggling with these issues. So his argument that this produces polytheism and idolatry is probably true. That would be the sin of this quadrant. This quadrant leads to leaders becoming gods is probably true. This quadrant leading to the group becoming God is probably true. And this quadrant, I don't know what he says there, leading to Islamic monotheism, utterly legal, would be probably true.
The sin of the corporate environment would be that everybody would give lip service to the one God, whether there was a relationship there with God or not, because the social structure forces you to.
Yes.
And
that's Islam.
Yeah, yeah. The clear example of many gods in an individualistic setting is our own situation here in the United States, where you can worship or not worship whatever you want, and it's fine if it's good for you.
It's the New Age.
Yeah, New
Age produces polytheism. It's this individualism and anarchy. So it's not to say that you couldn't have believers in monotheism in that context, but the regime tends to allow that to happen. In other words, and keeping truth in all of these, there's a tension toward error in all of them, I would say. Now, is that?
Yeah, last question. Is there a Christian regime then?
Okay. One of the things that I've been trying to say all along.
All cultures are prisons of disobedience.
That's right.
One seems to be more conducive, though, to obedience.
You see, here's an issue that you have to keep in mind is that in the latest theoretical expression of this, every culture has all expressions of this in it. In other words, there is no society and culture that does not have each one of these in some degree present. So, for example, if you were to go to Egypt and you were to study Egypt intensively during the time of Moses, if we could do that. You would find the bureaucracy, the despotic slavery, and all of these things, but you would also find in that same Egyptian social world each of these other things, according to the theory. And that within them this would create tensions and conflict within the society of Egypt. That it's not only the Israelites who had some disagreements about this, that there were Egyptians that had some disagreement about it. And there would be some of them that would emphasize equity, and there would be some that would emphasize corporate hierarchy. But apart from Pharaoh, other rival families that said, Pharaoh thinks he's God and he acts like a bureaucrat, but he really doesn't have all of the power. We're the priests, and we have the power, and we represent a counterpower group, and we know that he was born here, and we watched him grow up. We use him as the God because he's convenient to us. But basically, there's this whole priestly class in Egypt that had its own power, its own corporate identity, it had its land. In fact, the scriptures tell us that the land was owned, all the land was owned by the Pharaoh except that which was held by the priest. And so the priests constitute a corporate group of some kind. And so the nature of this structure then is one in which this looks like it's more conducive to monotheism, but it also leads to slavery if you have a despotic ruler like Pharaoh, and it can lead to another form of monotheism or other dimensions of it. So in looking at that and saying that all of this is present in every society, then what we do as we bring the gospel in is we appeal to the authority and to their understanding of authority, and saying that there always is some authority, there is some hierarchy of some kind. It may not be very elaborated, like with the Dani. But if you were to go into Dani society, one of the things that I didn't explain in the book, which I've been thinking through a lot since, is space and time change the social environment for the Dani. If you get the Dani in the morning and look at what happens through their day, it's anarchy. But if in the morning they had a discussion at 5 o'clock before they got out for the daylight and said, let's have a feast today, then they move from, they have planned at a particular time in the day that they will not have anarchy anymore, that they will have equity. And they'll all feast together in the village plaza. Not only do they all have equity, but the equity is initiated by a chief who comes out and starts it and says, here's my plate, everybody come, it's time for us to begin. And so there is a notion of authority. They have the Brazilian patron, who is a notion of authority. It's not wholly corporate in the sense of, but they go down and say, we're his children, he'll take care of us. So the patron on the river is the corporate authority for them. They belong to his group. He provides a certain dimension of life for them. So if you begin to communicate to the gospel to them, you can use the whole notion of patron. You can use the notion of God as the only one. And talk about the fact that there are many patron on the river, but your patron gets very angry when you go to another one and don't work for him. And God doesn't want to have any other gods before him. You could use that in terms of communicating the gospel to them. So in looking at the Dani, what I would say is that all those dimensions are there, perhaps even this one, although the patron is a slave owner. Some of those Indians really were almost slaves to the patron. So in a real sense, you got all four of those. And it's a very simple society with just no more than 150 relationships possible. But all of these are there through space and time. And it's not an exclusive, it's all this or all that. That's the error of transforming culture. It presents it like the Dani are this way, the Aucan are this way, the Yappies are this way, and corporate Christian college faculty are this way. And what, in fact, the truth of it is that if you looked at the dominant themes in their lives, that's how they are. But if you look at the harmony, or if you look at it like a symphony, look at then what constitutes the other melodic lines. In every one you'll find these other melodic lines in somewhere or another playing out. If we take the notion of Israel, Israel had to move, they were in bondage to slavery. They had to get out of that before they could realize that they should be in bondage to God. They went through all of this ultimately to establish the notion of being exclusively committed to God, but then fell back into idolatry and anarchy. Even when David was the king and he reinstituted the sacrifices, they rebelled against God. Solomon did, certainly, in going his own way. falling into sin, and this kingdom was split. You had more egalitarianism and equity emerging as a force. Those social forces, I think, are not the same as the truth of God's revelation to them. They impinge upon it. They keep people in prison, but they don't constitute it. Now,
That's very helpful. That's very helpful.
I still struggle because I'm not, is there a godly regime? I think this is why I think the notion that Wildowski and Ellis and Thompson come up with, that these are all present, is a much more helpful notion. And that there is no one then closed off from the possibility of comprehending this truth about God, but they may have to go through what Wildowski calls the U-turn to get there. In other words, they may have to work through these issues to ultimately understand, and they may not then stay there once they've understood it. They may become a church that's anarchical in its orientation, or they may become one that's equity in its orientation, or one that's hierarchical as the church grows. And then that will in turn put them into bondage again. And the church will always struggle against being in bondage. Someone has suggested that perhaps being here in the center is it. I'm not so sure. I think probably the truth of it is that understanding this tension is always with us, and that the world is always trying to squeeze us into its mold is really what we need to understand. And that it will be a battle until we die, until we are in the kingdom with the Son, rejoicing in His presence. At that time we'll be free from that tension, but not until that time. The 7 churches in Revelation, I think, illustrate this quite well, because each one of them, in some kind of tension with these issues, either failed or stood, but stood under great pressure. And if you look at the discussion of those churches, the ones that failed in terms of certain kinds of sins, certain kinds of lapses in terms of their commitment. The ones that were commended as being strong were the ones that were standing in great tension, under great opposition. And that seems to me to be what the truth of a vital church is, standing under great opposition. So,
do you feel in Wildowski that his concept of God remains static, or does it get redefined in terms of legitimacy needs of the people as they pass through these different regimes?
I think that they, as they pass through different regimes, gain different understanding of God.
Okay,
I think that's what he's saying, is this is a school.
So then God in Wildowski is not really literal then? He's figurative?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so.
No. I think God is literal. God is working with Moses, teaching Moses and the people about Himself and what it means. Now, I can't speak for him, but because I don't know what's in his heart. I don't know what's in his mind. But let's put it that way. That's the way I would read it, whether Wildowski reads it that way or not.
But the legitimacy needs differ, don't they? Or am I off on that?
The legitimacy needs of each regime?
Of each regime differ.
Yeah. They do.
So, I mean, if he believes in a literal God, but it's like you said, it does get, the God concept, it seems like, gets redefined.
Well, look at it this way. He's not really writing a book on theology. Right. He's writing a book on leadership.
I realize that.
And so if you keep that in focus, the book is about what is the nature of relationship between leaders and people. Okay. And who is that leader accountable to? And who are the people accountable to? And the whole notion of Moses as a political leader is Moses is accountable to God. Okay. That's Moses' accountability all the way through. And ultimately Moses fails to enter the promised land because of idolatry. He falls back into the idolatry that he's warned about from the very beginning. And so the whole notion then of accountability here is that the leader is accountable to God. Okay? Now the leader is also accountable to the people, and the whole story is the story of a leader and the leader's process to try to help lead a people to become a people in relationship to God. And that, to me, is the notion of what we have to try to keep in focus. I think that if we try to make too much theology out of Wildowski, we're going to get in trouble because, number one, he's not writing theology. Number two, he doesn't see it from a Christian theological perspective. He sees it from a Jewish theological perspective. And he draws heavily upon the Jewish scholarship. But again, I think we need to understand that the Jewish scholars have been studying God's Word for thousands of years. And they've been struggling to understand it, and God has given them enough understanding to begin to comprehend what He wants, because He says He's holding them accountable. That they will not be excused, that they have the Word of God, they'll be held to a higher standard, Paul says in Romans. And that they're not going to get off the hook because somehow they didn't have the special revelation of Christ that was there in the Word, it was adequate. So what they've learned, I think we can learn from. But we need to see it through the eyes of faith and our relationship to Jesus Christ. Are there other unanswered questions you're struggling with here?
Can we say that in order to have a Christian regime, which God is the ultimate ruler, and then He wants to be our only God, so He has to allow us to go through all that steps. And we were enslaved by the ruler of this world. We are in our Egypt, spiritually speaking, and then we cry out to Him. You know, Jesus is like Moses. You know, deliver us out of that Exodus, this slavery state. And then we move to anarchy. Sometimes we feel kind of we're weak. We want to do our own thing, and then self-denial. You know, constantly struggle with that. And
you're describing a spiritual odyssey that goes through the same process.
I can learn from this.
Well, perhaps you're right. In other words, perhaps the truth of it is that the Christian life is the journey through this.
Exactly.
Instead of the stop.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one of the things that we can learn from it.
Yeah.
Well, let's break there. Thank you. All right, we're still on page 59. A long discussion carried on and on and on. And I'd like to begin with section B in your outline, slavery, passive people, passive leader. In thinking about this particular section of the book, there are a number of questions that I prepared for our discussion tonight. And the first one, what are the biblical evidences that Moses was a passive leader when God called him? Let's just reflect on this for a couple of minutes. The notion of passive leadership, what kind of, as you look at Exodus chapter 3 and 4, what evidence do you see here that Moses was passive? Verse 11? Okay, what does it say there, Amy?
Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?"
Okay, who am I that I should go to God? Go to Pharaoh, okay? What's the significance of that question? What's he saying?
I don't want to do it.
I don't want to do it?
No confidence in himself.
No confidence in himself. Okay, who am I? You know, how could I possibly do this kind of thing? All right, what else do you see? Other passages in this text?
He asked for a sign to go with him.
Okay.
And he's God to work. It's God that's actually the authority, not him.
Okay, he wants some proof that God really wants him to do this. Some kind of supernatural reassurance. Anything else you see here?
He says, what if they ask me what your name is? What am I going to tell them then?
Okay.
So he wants some proof to the identity of God, or if God is actually...
Okay, as Wildowski deals with this, what does he say about that question? The proof of God's by giving me your name. Okay, well, authority and legitimacy in what way? Why do you... What's that have to do with the name?
The name gives you control.
The name gives you control. Okay, why?
You own it. It's yours. If you have something's name, you can call it. You can call it to you and operate its power.
Okay, if you have something's name, God's name, then you have control over the God. That's part of the pagan belief. Okay, it's part of the whole conceptualization of the notion of pagan gods, that if you know the name of the God, then and you can possess that God, then you can ask that God and you have some kind of control over that God, you perform ritual, that God should respond to you. So Wildavsky says this was a ploy by Moses to gain control over God. Well, what do you think? Do you agree with that or not?
Well, he's kind of said the guy was kind of, well, maybe I'm interpreting what Wildavsky says, that God won't give it to him. Who do you say I am? Why do you care, Moses? I'm not going to tell you my name. But I think we would say that I am is the name of God, that it's a powerful name of God, that God did reveal himself to Moses.
Okay. The notion of that is indeed a name, but it's a name that doesn't, it places you beyond, kind of the dimension of ordinary gods, in a sense, I am that I am. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's his name. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, probably they wouldn't interpret that necessarily as being a name, because the name is the name of those men, their ancestors. And I think that is, in a sense, some of the essence of it. Bob?
But he also wants to be able to call on God's name for power in the future.
Okay.
To get him out of things.
That's right. He wants to be able to call upon God's name in the future to get him out of trouble. He's anxious. He's insecure. He's saying, I can't do this. Okay, if you're going to make me do this, then who are you, so that I know who to call on? In a sense, that's the kind of question he's asking. Okay, Andy.
Isn't there some sort of interpersonal aspect here too, where it's wanting to, if you have contact with someone on a personal basis, you're going to want to know their name, just as a human need?
Sure. A human need. You're going to have contact. You want to know who you're addressing. How do I address this person? Okay, good.
There's an ambiguity too. Moses doesn't know who he is. And if he knows who God is, the author states that he's afraid of an idolatry. Moses kind of slipping into an idolatry. But he doesn't know who he is exactly, and God is choosing to keep him in that ambiguity, not totally revealing himself either.
Okay.
So there's a tension there, and God chooses to keep him in that tension.
Okay. It's interesting. I've heard many messages on Moses before, and Moses' reluctance to go in this, but I never really conceptualized it in terms of the whole notion of leadership and the reluctance of people to take it. And I'm beginning to see that this is much more common than I had thought. As you think about this, what do you think? Sue,
Well, I was just thinking, I had put it into the grid of, like, if I was in the village or something, I really didn't want to make a decision, I would go back and say, well, my director says.
Okay.
And it kind of absolves me of responsibility. And so I guess I was putting Moses in this in the whole context of a passive leader. He can come back, the Lord has told me to say this.
Okay.
Don't get mad at me, talk to him.
Okay, all right. Okay, that passivity is one not wanting to take responsibility, not wanting to have the cold weight of leadership placed upon your shoulders, rather being able to say, my director said this. Okay, that's good. How many of you have been asked to be leaders and have been passive about it and reluctant to take it and not desire it? Okay? I did this with my deans this morning, and it's interesting, they all nodded their heads. They all empathized and identified with that notion that, why is the Lord asking me to do this? And why is it that I am the one? I never forget when the president asked me to consider being provost. I walked out and I prayed, God, why? Why would you want to do this to me? Why is it that you would, ask me to give up what I love so much? Being in my office alone, writing books, and, preparing my lessons and teaching classes, and being free of all that burdensome responsibility and meeting with people. I mean, it's the last thing I really wanted to do. I had the same kind of dialogue. Why me? I'm just not qualified for this thing. I don't want to do this. I didn't ask him for a rod, and I didn't have a snake. But, I know what this is. I've gone through this myself. And it's fascinating. I wonder how many Christian leaders go through this experience, and how many of them struggle in this way, and ask, There are some people that really want to be leaders. They have that ambition. But I'm not sure that they really want to be leaders. I think what they maybe want is somehow to achieve. And that seems the way to achieve. That seems the way to go. But I've talked to some who have really wanted to be leaders, and then they've gotten in the position, they say, why did I ever want this? You know, why did I ever desire to have this? This is not what I thought it was going to be. You know, and so, you know, that perhaps the desire to want it is a little bit like Achan's desire to want to be a leader, or someone else's desire to say, hey, I want to have this power, I want to have this authority. But when you get into it and discover what it's about, then you maybe become passive as well. I'm not sure. But the notion of the passive leader really rang a bell to me. And I wonder if it's not more typical than we would think of people that go into leadership. That the fear of it, the notion that that somehow I'm inadequate is one of those things that I know certainly appear to me. And I think it appears to many. Well, let's go on to the next question. What is the rod? Why is the rod a symbol of ambivalence in relationship to power? If you have Wildowski's book, he discusses this on page 39. But Exodus 4:3 is interesting. It says, the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Okay, what's the significance of that? Bob? He was scared, okay. Why did God give him the rod in the first place, or do this?
I think it was to say he would meet Moses, give him, here's some power that I'll give you. It was, in other words, because Moses was still quandering about how he was going to do things.
I should have read the first verse, because that puts it right in context. Moses said, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say the Lord has not appeared to you? And so then the Lord says, what's that in your hand? A staff. And he throws it down. And so in this act, God is demonstrating to him that I am God. He's showing Moses right off the bat that he's really God, that he's not just somebody playing games with Moses, that it's God that he's dealing with. Why does this rod connote ambivalence?
Power cannot be abused.
Power cannot be abused. Okay, why?
Well, it's because it's not his power, it's God's power.
Okay, it's interesting. Moses had the rod in his hand. The staff was in his hand. It was just an ordinary old staff. It was the kind of staff he'd always had and he carried when he was out in the wilderness. So it wasn't like some magic staff. Something that, I mean, the Lord said, what is that in your hand? A staff. You know, it's just a staff. Okay, it's not some magical thing that has been passed on from generation to generation. It's not something that has some inherent power. It's just my staff. Well, throw it on the ground. And it turned into a snake and he ran from it. So in that sense, it's truly a demonstration of God's power. It's something ordinary that Moses was familiar with, that he was part of his daily life. God turns into something that he fears. Okay. Now, how would that be relevant to leadership, and what does it tell us about it? Have any of you been in a situation where God has taken something ordinary that you work with, or an ordinary aspect of your life, and turned it into something that you're afraid of? Okay, what, Amy?
Well, sometimes he gave us gifts in order to further his kingdom in the ministry. And it's so easy just to hold it and become my own, then abuse it and gain honor, power, or prestige for myself, selfish desire. Then disaster comes. So whenever I sense this extra gift that God has given, immediately I dedicate back to him. Lord, this is yours. Show me how to use it. Be a steward, good steward, yeah, okay. Whatever it is.
Okay, that's very, very, very good. This is a really crucial dimension of understanding leadership. God takes ordinary gifts that he gives you, and he imbues them with power. And when he does that, the danger is that you will take that power and you'll use it for yourself. And if you do, it'll be like a snake that comes back and bites you. It will have that same kind of impact in terms of its reversal on you. The ambivalence in relationship to power is one where the power itself is so great that it can turn upon you. That it can be something that captures you instead of you being the vessel for it for God's work. You still look puzzled, Sue.
No, I'm processing.
Okay. Some men, for example, have been given a tremendous gift of preaching. A great gift of preaching. And that gift can turn back and become a snake to bite them. Because if they use it primarily to gain glory for themselves, to gain influence over people, to be effective in terms of whatever they deem appropriate, it can become a source of destruction for them. We talk about, for example, Oral Roberts as one who really was touched by God, who had a tremendous gift of power and was used in a tremendous way, but began to build a kingdom for Oral Roberts, perhaps, you know. And this is not an accusation of, but perhaps, just perhaps, that became more important. And the kingdom has collapsed now. You know, the whole thing is falling apart because the power was turned to something that perhaps wasn't what God had for him. And it became then a snake that's bitten him. A thing that's made him scorned and ridiculed among other Christian leaders because of the fact that he's had to sell off his tower. He's had, in great financial difficulties, all these things have kind of collapsed and fallen apart. So the issue then is one that power is something that's very dangerous. The power of God given to us is something that has to be used with a great deal of humility. As Amy has said, it has to be given back to God. It's not something that you can use on our own. Now, with the rod, what happened to Moses? He hit the rock twice. You see, that staff, and this is the first time I've really understood that, that staff was just an ordinary staff that Moses was carrying on the day he met God the first time. There was nothing powerful or unique about it. And God worked in him and took that staff and made it something that did great miracles. And Moses began to believe in the rod instead of believing himself. And that's ultimately the idolatry that caused him to fall. That he believed in the rod, which was really a gift from God, something that he had himself, but it was a gift from God. Now that can happen to me, it can happen to you, it can happen to any one of us when we get involved in God's work. If we begin to rely upon the gifts that God has given us and somehow believe in them, they become the snake that bites us. They become the trap that gets. The ambivalence of power is that power can turn against us. He also talks about, well, in Wildowski says, power is to be used but not abused. It should be wielded only in faith. And I think that's very, very sound advice for Christian leaders and for training Christian leaders, that it's to be wielded only in faith. It should never be wielded in the strength of our own eyes and insight. Now, the temptation that I face on a regular basis is God has given me a gift for preaching. And it's easy to have an engagement, to have to pick up and go somewhere, just grab a message, take it along, get up there and preach it. But there's no power in that message if it's not God's work. If God isn't the one that's doing it, I can give up and I can give an oration and use Scripture and all those other kinds of things that go with it. And I can even get compliments and come away with people saying, hey, this was a very nice message and all of that. But if it's not really used for God's purpose and God's work and in the humility of the Spirit and in faith that this is something that God is going to use for His purpose, and I'll never know what He's going to do with it because it's really His, then it becomes empty and it just becomes an act. And it becomes just like a magic show. This is no different, no better. It's like throwing down your rod, it turns into a snake and you pick it up. Hey, look, can you do that? Well, that's what it can be. So we have to be very careful that we don't use our gifts in that way. Okay, let's go on and take a look at Balaam and Jacob. How do the cases of Balaam and Jacob teach parallel principles? Just quickly, let's just take one of them. Let's take Balaam. Remember the story of Balaam?
He goes from a passive guy who's involved in a process to someone who's actively involved in the blessing through interaction with an angel on his donkey.
Okay, when first the king comes around and says, Balaam, would you curse Israel? He says, no, not me. Why not?
They're God's people.
Yeah, he knew that. He knew it very clearly. He said, these are God's people. God has already showed me that these are his people. There's no way I can curse them. I can only do what God tells me to do. And the king begs him and begs him and begs him. Come on, you know. And so what's he do?
He said, let me ask God. It's not necessary.
Yeah. He asks God if he can go. And God tells him, no, don't go. And then he goes. Well, God lets him go then. God actually lets him go. He says, all right, go ahead. But on the way, God tries to kill him. You know, the angel of the Lord tries to kill him. And he finally discovers it and realizes what's going on. What's the purpose of all that? What does Wildavsky argue?
Is it the abuse of power or the abuse of a gift?
It's really the abuse of a gift again. It's using the gift for money. You see, Balaam was on his way out to make money from Barak the king. He was tempted. You know, hey, he's going to give me a lot of money. He promised me anything I want. You know, even though God doesn't want me to do this, well, it'd be nice to go. And so God gave him permission to go. But then he challenged him, and the ass was used to rebuke him and say, "Listen, you're a fool." Now, the parallel that Wildavsky draws with this is the parallel of Moses and his wife. Why?
How his wife saved him?
Yeah, remember? You know, God met Moses, we're going to kill Moses too. Okay, so that you have that parallel there, that interesting parallel. And it's one of those complex and difficult texts in Exodus that interpreters have always struggled with, and perhaps we should have gone and looked at what the Jewish writers have said about it, because there are some significant parallels in these things, which is, okay, Moses, you're doing this because you're doing it to get some glory and to get some honor for yourself. You know, you're going back and you're going to be a big person, or are you really God's person? Are you really going to use your gifts according to God's glory? And the whole notion here is this parallel is what Wildavsky has called the divided self. The divided self. The self that doesn't want to go, and the self that wants to go. The self that's selfish. The self that seeks its own recognition. And that divided self is the self that you struggle with. You know, it's interesting. He says Moses wants to lead, yet he seeks to escape. And what he's suggesting, I think, is that Moses wouldn't have minded being a big man. But on the other hand, it had a lot of dangers fraught with it, and that's a tension that he faced. I like the comment on page 48 that leaders who are named to be leaders must do their duty, whether or not God protects them. They must do their duty, whether or not God protects them. And perhaps that's the most important lesson to learn from this, that whether or not God protects you, it's your responsibility to follow him. It's your responsibility to do what he says. In a real sense, that's the essence of Moses. Moses was going off into Egypt. And on his way there, God attempts to kill him. Okay? And apparently, the sacrifice or the circumcision of his son, or whatever that turned out to be, through his wife, is what protects him. And the whole point of it is that when you're called to leadership, when you're called to do God's work, you're not necessarily called to be protected. And perhaps this was an object lesson for Moses to know what he was going to be in for as he went further. Because if you look at the life of Moses, he was never protected in the sense of being protected from abuse, protected from hostility, protected from rejection. The people are always complaining. They were always embittered against him. He was never a popular leader in the sense of everybody saying, hey, great, you know, let's applaud Moses today. We don't find any text where the people are all standing clapping for Moses and saying what a wonderful job that he did. Now, the interesting thing about it is that most of us would like to be leaders for the clapping. But none of us want to be leaders for the pain. I don't want to be a leader for the pain. That's what I was arguing with God about. You know, I don't want to go through the suffering. I don't want to go through the agony. And after I finished the meeting I had this morning, I knew I had a lot of pain ahead of me. I got some tough things I got to do. Why do you do this to me, Lord? I want to quit. Yeah. I remember back on Tuesday, I got out of another meeting. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm ready to quit. You know, it's a lot easier being just a professor in intercultural studies. You know, don't feel like doing this. Well, that's really what leadership is about. It's the pain. And as I've studied this lesson in preparation for tonight, I realized that pain is part of what leadership is about. And God doesn't promise to protect you from pain. He says you've got to do it. You're called to leadership, and so you go through the pain, whether or not God protects you. In essence, that's the story of Balaam, it's the story of Moses, and it's the story of Jacob. And you can go back and follow through those parallels. Okay, let's go on to page 60 and take a look at From Slavery to Anarchy. First question, what is the key contrast between Joseph's leadership and Moses' leadership? Think of it first of all in terms of the children of Israel. What did Joseph do with the children of Israel? Okay, he brought them into a better life. Truly, what did Joseph do? Steve?
He enslaved them.
He led them into slavery. He did. He led them into slavery. It's exactly what he did. Now, it wasn't his intention, but that's the outcome. That's effectively what he did. What were they coming down there for?
Food.
Food. And not only food, what else?
Protection.
Protection. You know, the good life, if you will, because the good life was in Egypt. It wasn't back in Canaan. Things were tough in Canaan. There was famine in Canaan. So they came down there to have a more comfortable life, to have a better life than the one they had. They were invited by Joseph, and he was in the palace. He had much to offer them, and so they came down. They had good land. They had good opportunities. So they went into Egypt for food, security, and slavery. Okay, what else did Joseph offer them? Not necessarily offer to them personally, but what did Joseph, by following Joseph, what did they get? What political advantages?
The fact that he was Pharaoh's right-hand man, he gave them a higher status.
Okay. They were his family, the family of the second in the land. So then there was definitely status that they got out of this. Joseph's character. What was Joseph's character like?
Upright.
Upright. Integrity was the mark of Joseph, wasn't it? Integrity was a definite mark. So there was nothing at all flawed in what Joseph offered. He was a man of integrity. And so you have the power, the integrity, all of that is what they got when they got from Joseph. Now, what about Moses? Israel and Moses. Okay, Moses led them out. Joseph led them into slavery. Moses led them out. Was Joseph a powerful man?
Yeah.
What about Moses? Okay.
He's a very powerful man.
Moses?
Well, he didn't have the
That's not how
acceptance.
he saw himself. How many people did he command? Who was under his household? Moses was not a powerful man, John.
With the divine legitimacy.
Well, God was the power, not Moses.
Okay, but still, what was the end result?
Don't you remember? God said, throw your staff down. Okay, who turned it into the snake? So Moses was not a powerful man. It says he was the meekest man on earth.
He started out with some power in Pharaoh's court. You could maybe compare that, but then he lost it.
He lost it. That's right. And he was a refugee. Okay. He was the exact opposite of Joseph. He was one who fled. He was a fugitive. Okay. He was out of Egypt on the run. And he was afraid to come back because if he did, he might get executed for the murder that he'd committed. So if you think of their character, Moses was a treacherous. He was not a man of integrity. He was caught in deception. He was one who murdered. He fled because of the murder. He was found as a refugee in the wilderness. God met him in a bush. And when he led the people out, what did he lead them out into? Desert?
Yeah.
What else?
Battles.
Battles? What about their bellies?
Hunger.
Empty, hunger. And what about water? Thirst. Okay, now, who is the better leader? Moses and Joseph.
Humanly, Joseph.
Okay, humanly Joseph, but in terms of, let's just take a crass human leadership. Which one was the more effective leader?
Considering the end result of Moses too?
Yeah.
It's easy to lead people on the good stuff. It's harder.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's easy to lead people into the picnic, into the feast. It's easy to get people to come for handouts. For Moses to get these people to walk out of Egypt into the wilderness, he really had to be a significant leader, a leader empowered by God to lead people in a way that was just beyond. Number one, if you look at all the characteristics of Moses, he was not the right guy. We would never have chosen him. When we look for leaders, we would have said, well, look at his career. Look at his record. I mean, we wouldn't hire this guy. We wouldn't even let his beta get to the bottom of the list. Pitch that one away. He's a fugitive. He's a treacher. He's out here in the wilderness. He doesn't have a good record of leadership at all. I mean, he'd never get hired. He would never get hired. We wouldn't consider him. Moses was not someone that you would look over his resume and put him in the position. Joseph was. Joseph had a track record, everywhere he went. Yeah, look, he did this. He was so good. He was effective in the prison, He interpreted these dreams. And so then Pharaoh's got a problem. He's got a dream he can't interpret. Well, we know this guy. He's good. Bring him in. He'll do it for you. So, Joseph had all the credentials. He was the one who filled the bill. Now, the reason I point this out to you is that God used this weak man. He used a man who had bad credentials. He used a man that nobody would hire. And he did great things. The toughest job in the world, to take a people who were comfortable out of their comfort and take them out into the wilderness to starve to death and lead them out to make them a different people. Now that's what the task of the church is. That's what the task of the church is. It's to call people out of comfort, call people out of the blindness that they have, the spiritual blindness, to try to help them to see that they're in slavery, prisons to their own culture, and that the slavery is comfortable, and that it's not something that you really want to break out of, and to help them to begin to see that there is a path to follow, that's a path to glory, but it's got a lot of desert in it. It's got a lot of starvation, it's got a lot of hunger, it's got a lot of anguish. It's not a path of pleasure. It's not the way it is. And in God taking the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the promised land, they went through all the things that the church has to go through. The analogy to the church is a very powerful one. Because there's suffering, there's persecution, there's cost, there's anguish. The history of the church through time has been that. It's been dying to self, taking up your cross and following me. And to lead people into the wilderness, you need to have people who are willing to submit to that. So if you think about Moses and Joseph and you begin thinking about recruiting leaders, church planning and other kinds of things, be sure you're not looking for the qualifications of Joseph. You probably need the Moses. The one who is going to respond to God's call will be humble and meek and recognize he has no power and recognize that God's got to work through him and do it through him. And the fascinating history of the church and the story of the church is that. It's exactly that. The gifted, like me, never really amount to much. But the great ones, the ones like George Verwer, you know, who dress like jerks and talk like jerks, and God does great things, you know. He really leads them into a sacrificial life, you know, where he gives his all. You never see him wearing a suit, never see him wearing a tie. You don't see him taking big offerings or doing any of this kind of stuff. He doesn't have a big church, but he's got a passion for the world and leading people out to reach people for Christ. And so, in thinking about this, Moses, not Joseph. Now that doesn't mean that Joseph was a bad man. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying when you got a task where you got to lead people out of comfort into the wilderness, Joseph is not the one. You know, you need a Moses. How does the hardness of Pharaoh's heart and the Egyptian experience provide a school for Israel? Second question. Why do they need to go to school? Exodus chapter 5. Exodus chapter 6. What do you see in these passages? Exodus 5, verse 5, the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Go back to the work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and the foremen in charge of the people. You're no longer to supply the people with straw for bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They're lazy. That's why they're crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and pay no attention to the lies. So they went out. And the foreman went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says. Now, verse 15, then the Israelite foreman went and appealed to Pharaoh, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told, make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. What's going on here?
God is giving them something to remember after they leave Egypt. Not just with that incident, but with the plagues, and every time Pharaoh hardened his heart, they remembered. Ultimately, the Passover became such a central part in their identity, their new identity as a nation.
Yeah. How does this whole incident set the people up to leave?
You know, Pharaoh's not such a nice guy. I mean, it's not such a nice life here. Begin to shake him up a little bit, get some roots.
That's right. They're truly breaking the relationship. Have you ever broken a relationship? And you know what happens in a broken relationship? What do you do to break it? You start being mean to the other person, don't you? I do it. You know, I was. I remember this. Yeah, I was mean to the other person. I said things, I did things that I knew would hurt them. Now, I'm ashamed of that today. But that's what happened. Well, here's what Pharaoh's doing. You're a bunch of jerks. Go back to work, you know. Now, God had a purpose in this because he knew these people were comfortable. He knew they really weren't ready to go into the wilderness and starve. That they had to have a little bit more pain before they'd be willing to walk out. And so this is what he was doing. He was escalating the pain a little so that people would get ready to walk out. But to do that, there had to be some price to pay. So here's what happened. Now we think of how terrible Pharaoh was, but Pharaoh was doing the Lord a favor. He was really doing the Lord a favor because, you see, they had this relationship. They saw themselves as servants. They said, your servants. You know, look what you're doing to your servants. And I think Wildowski makes that point, that there was this relationship between them. They saw themselves as belonging to Pharaoh. And God had to break that, to separate them from that. So in doing this, by giving them no straw for their bricks, making them do the same amount of work, all of a sudden it wasn't just a routine day anymore. And Pharaoh is probably right, that they were kind of having a good time, you know? Hey, time to go to work today. You go out, work on making your bricks. You got straw, it's already provided. You know, you sit around and talk to each other. I watch people in this kind of setting work together, and they enjoy working together. They have a good time at their work. They talk to each other. It doesn't tell us that they were being beaten. They were only beaten after they wanted to leave. That's when they started getting beaten. And so maybe I'm making them look too good, but the pain increases here. The pain definitely increases. And as the pain increases, the people are better prepared to go. Okay, now Murray was right in talking about the other things. The other things were also to teach them, to help them to remember, to see the pain the Egyptians went through and how Israel was delivered, the separation between them. And that's an important point. Any other observation you want to make there before we move on? What other kinds of school? Andy?
I think that since they'd been in slavery for 400 years, that they probably hadn't seen God be real active in taking them out. They thought that he was probably silent. And I think that he was making himself visible so that they could see that this God of their forefathers still was active. Sort of like Gideon, you know, after all that time. And God had sort of been silent and needed more proof to see that this really is the God that I've always heard about. And
the stories are not just stories. God is real. Okay, that's important. And the manifestation of that reality in their lives. There was another person that had to do some learning as well. That was Pharaoh. And so the key, I think, that we're seeing here is that it was not only Pharaoh that was going to school, it was Israel that was going to school as well. They both had some key things to learn if this whole thing was going to happen. Okay, the third question. How does the Exodus result in anarchy among the people in Israel? The best place to answer this is over in Exodus 14. Let's take a quick look. Exodus 14:10 and some of the following verses. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up. There were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified. They cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die here in the desert." Okay, what are we seeing there?
When circumstances change, people get threatened and then they just lose control.
Okay, all right. Number one, they're angry. They're a bunch of angry people. You know, they're angry because they've been separated from their material wealth. They've been separated from their comfort. They don't have the routine jobs anymore. And now here they are. They've got this army coming after them, and they're all upset because here's this army coming after them, and they wish they were back home. Okay, that's a key part of it. You know, there's a lot of intense anger.
I was thinking as slaves, they didn't have to make a whole lot of decisions about what they were going to do, and all of a sudden they're faced with major, what are we going to do?
Okay, that's right. Major decisions. Life has changed. You're in a whole new context.
And they had just come out of a structure of some hierarchy or authority, and they don't want to go into that again under Moses. They don't want to have to experience the same kind of a power of submission again.
Okay. All right. This whole dynamic here of leave us alone, it would be better to serve the Egyptians, that's their response. Now Moses tells them not to be afraid, and verse 16, raise out your staff, stretch your hand over the sea to divide the water, and in this situation they go across onto dry land. Okay, chapter 15, verse 24 and 25. Moses cried out to the Lord. Okay, why was he crying out? Because they're at Marah. And 3 days they traveled into the desert without finding water. After this marvelous miracle of getting across the sea, they come to Marah. They could not drink its water because it was bitter. And so the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Now here's the same rebellion again, the same anger, the same hostility coming forward. And Moses cried out to the Lord. The Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Then the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there he tested them. He said, "If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Okay. So now you have the beginning of the teaching, the beginning of the process to try to help these people begin to comprehend. And it's looking back at Egypt and saying, here are the diseases, here are the plagues that happened to those people. If you follow me, I'll protect you from them. But if you don't, then they'll come upon you as well. So you have the rebellion and God's commandment now that there's going to be an accountability. Well, we go on, chapter 16, verse 2 and 3. What happens again? Sue?
Same thing, they come up with a problem and they complain.
Okay.
What are we going to do? It seems like, in Egypt they had a clear authority, Pharaoh. They knew who was in charge, and now all of a sudden they don't know who's in charge, and God is, I'm in charge.
Okay.
I'm in charge. And this seems to be the lesson.
And they don't like it, do they?
No, I can't see him.
No, that's right. They don't like it. God's in charge. I can't see him. We don't like what's going on around here. Things aren't working out the way we thought they were going to work out. And so you have people angry and people all upset and speaking out against God. Chapter 17 plays out the same theme. If you look at chapter 17, verses 3 and 4, more problem with water. Verse 2, they quarreled with Moses, give us water to drink. Moses said, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst? So repeatedly, the same thing comes up. Now, this is what God had purposed. He knew that they were going to go out into the desert. In fact, he led them the hard way so they wouldn't go running back into Egypt. The sea was closed behind them, so they couldn't go back. And so now they're out in the desert, they hit the tough times, and they want to go back. What parallels can you see in that in a Christian life?
Well, you continually forget how faithful God has been in the past. You
Okay.
say, can God do it this time? I don't know if I can trust him. And you complain.
Continually forget and complain. Don't know if you can trust God this time. I agree with you. So often it happens. Somebody else.
When we complain or grumble, the situation will not turn good, and then will lead us into sin and destruction. So we better remember the blessings in the past and begin to praise Him regardless. Praise Him in all circumstances and give thanks.
One of the men in my church, who I have a Bible study with almost every week, says to me, nobody ever told me when I became a Christian that there was going to be so much suffering. They always told me that God would make a difference in your life, that He would change my life, He would really give me a whole new world, and He would solve my problems. He said, they didn't tell me that there was going to be all this pain. Didn't tell me there were going to be these troubles. Didn't tell me that life was going to be tough. And he was very angry a lot of the times. He was very upset with what was happening in his life. And he said, I'm frustrated that things aren't going the way I want. Why isn't it that the Christian life is like this? Nobody told me about this. Nobody told me about judgment, he said. Nobody said that God was going to judge me if I didn't serve other people. And he said, I feel guilty and I know that I'm not doing what I ought to be doing. And he was really frustrated with that. Well, maybe he wouldn't have become a Christian. If Moses had told them all in Egypt that it was really going to be tough out there in the desert, that they were going to starve, there wouldn't be any food, there wouldn't be any leeks and garlics, there was going to be sleeping on the ground, they wouldn't have protection from the wild animals. So let's go, gang. Well, no. Probably they wouldn't have followed. So what's necessary? What's necessary is to come alongside the people when they're in the desert and begin to help them remember and see how God is faithful. That God does care for them, that this is what the Christian life is all about. And while it was different before, it wasn't that good. I mean, you forget how bad it was before. Being a slave wasn't really that great. It just looks great from this angle because you've got troubles that are different now. And so you have to deal with those issues. Well, that's what leadership is about. Leadership is helping people come to grips with the fact that the Christian life is not a picnic, that it's not a nice outing in the park, that it's not just a Sunday afternoon drive or a visit to church, that there's a commitment to make, that there's some tough life to follow, that there's struggles to go through, and that there's an awful lot of pain perhaps that goes with it. And that's part of what it means as you follow that. Andy?
I think another thing, another parallel, and it sort of takes on a positive note, but I'm learning in my own life that I think the Lord is pleased when we have personal memorials to God's faithfulness in our life. And like how He instituted or instated the practice of Passover, that it was a reminder every year for how God had passed over them. And later on, when the Israelites are crossing Jordan and the Lord tells them to take the rocks with them as a reminder, I'm learning to do that, to do special things for special occasions in my life. or you know, something like that, to do something, to buy something, go somewhere, do something as a special memorial for something that the Lord has done in your life. So I think that the idea of Passover carries into the Christian life too, or it should, I think.
Okay, good. I think that this whole notion of anarchy and remembering are two important issues. And that probably one of the things that happens to young Christians and what will happen in leadership is that new Christians in any kind of cultural situation where you plant a church, they're going to go through a phase of anarchy. They're going to go through a phase of wondering who is in charge and how should we follow and what direction is the church going in. You look at that in the New Testament, it was there as well. You had rival gospels. You had people preaching their own way. But in thinking about all this, we're looking at leadership again. Leadership understands that. And Moses' leadership, God called on Moses to endure the suffering, to let them criticize you, to keep coming back to God and asking God for miracles to keep showing them the way. And that's really what Moses did. He said, okay, God, what am I going to do now? And God gave him an answer and led him in that process. And so the leadership is constantly depending upon God to bring people in that context to a point where they'll follow him. So the anarchy is the natural product of people leaving slavery and then coming out into the pain of a new kind of life. Because a new kind of life is a struggle. It's different, and there's going to be pain and suffering in it. And the tendency then is to complain and grumble against the leaders, to get embittered with whatever happened, and to wander away. And some of them did. We don't have time to go into it. Okay, the next phase is from anarchy to equity. And we're running out of time, so we want to try to pull this together. There are three things that Wildowski talks about: the golden calf incident, the spies, and the binding of Isaac by Abraham as parallel things. Since we don't have much time, I think what I'll do is I'll focus on the issue of the golden calf. And we won't bother with the discussion of the parallels between the golden calf incident and the others. You might want to take a look at that after the class is over tonight. First of all, the notion of covenant. Wildowski does a good discussion of that on page 94, and I would encourage you to take a look at it and read it if you haven't. In Exodus chapter 19 and verses 4 to 6, we'll start with 3. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did in Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back, summoned the elders of Israel, of the people, and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. And the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord hath said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. Now, I won't go further in this. I would encourage you to read that again and reflect on it for yourself. But there is the notion of a covenant with God. But I think Wildowski makes a very important observation here, and that is that the commandments belong with the covenant. That they're not separated out. That a covenant without the commandments would be people have a relationship with God and no accountability. And so in a real sense, we come back to what you were saying, Murray. Is there just one right place for an understanding of a monotheistic God? Well, we do have to come to the point where we recognize there is a commandment. And if you go back to those Dani Indians, they don't recognize that. They have an amoral system in which whatever you do is okay. And one of the things that I understood as we began to try to share the gospel with them was that they had to understand, first of all, where the evil came from that was causing them pain. And they had to see that this pain was something that was a part of their daily lives. They didn't like it. Well, there was a cause for that, an underlying cause, and that comes with their rebellion against God. So what do we then do about it? There's a covenant. There is God's word. There's some basic conditions. And God says, if you follow those conditions, then I will have a relationship with you. And if you won't, there is no relationship. You've got to accept the covenant and some rules. The rule is a very simple one. If I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. That's the rule. And the commandment is that to believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. Pretty simple, not very elaborate, but it's foundational. And you've got to make that kind of commitment. You have to be willing to accept that. And that's a covenant kind of relationship. The Israelites had a covenant, but it was stated very clearly here that it was conditional upon their doing what God had commanded them to do. And we get the same message in the New Testament. Jesus says, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's a covenant relationship with him. Okay, in essence, he sums it up saying freedom as responsibility. In other words, there is no freedom apart from responsibility. Freedom is responsibility in that relationship. And the validation of the covenant, the violation of one aspect abrogates the other. If you don't follow the commandments, then you lose the covenant. They go together. Well, the golden calf then is the illustration of this in play. And I think this is a very powerful thing. We've studied this before. It's in Exodus chapter 32. And if you want to turn over and look at it, 32:19. Wildofsky makes an interesting point in this, that the law and its violation coexist. What is he saying? Is at the same time that God is giving Moses the tablets, the people are making a golden calf. Exact same time, same process. The people are making a golden calf. And so the law and its violation coexist. In other words, they exist at the same time. They come at the same moment. And as the people of the Israel get one, they're violating it on the other hand with the golden calf in opposition to this. This is a fascinating story, and another comment that he makes is that apostasy is one that occurs with the connivance of a leader. In other words, that people don't fall into apostasy without leaders coming along and cooperating and helping them do it. Again, the lesson for us in terms of Christian leadership, I think, is profound. That apostasy is something that occurs because leaders are leading in it. That leaders are conniving with the people, that they're working together to make this happen. And that it's an outcome of leaders and followers together engaging in things that lead them away from their faith and lead them away from their commitments to God. Well, the last thing that I would like to observe here that I think is really a crucial one is the connection between the initiative of the leader and the mercy of God. That Moses and God together are talking about mercy here. And the thing that I saw about this which impressed me so much is that when it came down to the crisis of God destroying these people, Moses said, take me. Destroy me first, or destroy me as well, that I'm with them. Now, I have to admit that I don't have that kind of commitment right now to the people that I'm leading. I'm not sure that I would say, well, God, you know, if you're going to destroy Biola, destroy me too. Yet that's the passion that Moses really had. If you see his dedication and commitment to the people of Israel, it was one to say that if you're going to destroy Israel, take me as well. That's a truth that I'd never seen before. And I thought it's a pretty powerful truth that we can take away from this. That our commitment to the people that God gives us to lead us should be so great, and our love for them so much, that if God is going to destroy them, he takes us with him.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.